All right, let's get real, folks. When it comes to anxiety, stress, depression, and even suicide, there's an overrepresentation of one group in particular that many might be surprised by, and that's white men. 68% of all suicides in 2022 in the United States were white men, and that number goes up for older white men. And I wonder sometimes about our diversity, equity, and inclusion push. Is that leading to further alienation of white men in particular? We know that alienation is a root cause of severe levels of depression. Once someone feels socially isolated, they're more likely to engage in self destructive habits, feelings of anxiety, stress, and depression. And this may compound into feelings of suicidal ideation. I think Forbes did a study, and 70% of white men felt completely alienated from current DEI policies. And I'm certainly not saying that DEI is a direct result and contributor to this overrepresentation of suicide amongst white men, but it can contribute to feelings of isolation and alienation by white men in particular. Now, a lot of my white friends, when I talk to them about, graduating high school and going out to college and university, they tell me that they were not only leaving home, they weren't really going back home either. They weren't going back to visit family and spend time with them nearly as much as they once did when they were younger. You see, for me in my culture, I go back to my parents' house every Sunday. We have lunch together. It's this whole wholesome thing. And I recognize that's not widely a thing. My parents and I have a very strong bond. My sister and I have a strong bond. My family and I have a very strong bond. That's not the same for white people. Many of them don't feel that strong bond with their family. In fact, when I tell them I go home and spend time with my parents every Sunday and I moved out in my early 20s, they're amazed. They can't believe that that's maintained. And I sometimes underplay the social connection and sense of belonging that my family and my extended family provides me to society. So I often wonder if leaving home early and not forming those bonds early is a contributing factor to feelings of social isolation, alienation, chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. And then there's medical assistance in dying, folks. I did a whole series on this in my podcast last month and also last year. And the federal government of Canada released its 5th annual report on medical assistance in dying. Here in Canada, if MAID was a cause of death, it will be in our top 10 causes of death here in Canada. It can't be qualified as such. But interestingly enough, in the report, the government found that 95.8% of individuals who received MAID identified as Caucasian. This is a high disproportionate number of white people in comparison to their percentage of the population, which is around 72% here in Canada. So a higher disproportionate number of white people are selecting MAID. Now, again, it could be because of chronic stress, anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation, which are higher in white people than non-whites. Colloquially, I volunteered at a homeless shelter here in downtown Toronto, and I'll tell you, there was an overrepresentation of white men at that homeless shelter. And I don't know if that's statistically true. I don't have the stats to back me up. But I can imagine that's the case in many homeless shelters across the G7 writ large. Despite more and more immigrants coming to our communities, there still is more white people in homeless shelters and even, committing suicide and depressed, anxious, and stressed out. So it gets me wondering about this intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Policies that are designed to make sure that underrepresented groups have a seat at the table, they're part of the decision making, they're part of the organization's culture. Now I wonder if those same policies are contributing in some way to feelings of alienation and isolation. And I'm reminded by the idea that, there aren't solutions, there's only trade-offs, something that Thomas Sowell talked about. And I wonder if the trade-off with diversity, equity, inclusion is a further isolation, further alienation of white men in particular. When you think of some of the policies, where do white men fit themselves in when it comes to, some of the talks that happen in the workplace? And also, what are workplaces doing to talk about that as well? And this gets a bit murky, right? Like, how does DEI also talk about the issues affecting white men? And perhaps this is also leading to a lot of white men feeling kind of resentful and not really with it when it comes to DEI, as if their own issues may be glossed over. And then I think of the white men who actually go to school, get good grades, get a good job, etc., make it to the top of their field, I can see them being cut at the knees by people saying, oh, that's because of your white privilege and not as a result of your hard work or your ability to go the extra mile, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this gets me wondering about the intersection of DEI and this feeling of isolation and alienation white men in particular have. And also for DEI proponents, knowing these statistics about white men, how will this be incorporated, or will it be incorporated in future DEI policies? I'd be curious to know. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you think DEI can actually include these statistics of white men, or do you think it's fundamentally diametrically opposed and it simply can't? Let me know what you think in the comment section below.